Hey, great to have you here. So today we're going to be taking a look at Dexter Original Sin, Episode 6, entitled The Joy of Killing. Before jumping into the details of the episode, I want to point out a few things ahead of time. So, one thing I thought about with New Blood and going to Resurrection, Dexter at the end of New Blood, if you haven't seen it, spoilers FYI for New Blood, but Dexter at the end of that wanted to be shot, and I kind of thought about, when he wakes up, is he going to have like a change of heart? Maybe his life flashed before his eyes, and that's why he doesn't want to die anymore, but I kind of realized, if he wakes up, he wanted to be shot, like he intended for Harrison to shoot him, and now he's just waking back up and he's going to be not wanting that to happen anymore. I don't know, but that's something I kind of thought about. I'm like, if he wakes up, he wanted to die, so is he changing his opinion there? So just something I thought about. Beyond that, we did get news of Batista, Harry, and Harrison's actors all coming back for Resurrection, so great news there. I still think at this point in time, we need to have something with Original Sin end off with Batista, whether it's the 1991 Batista actors, something relaying into Resurrection, or even having the modern-day Batista have some scene that begins Resurrection shown at the end of Original Sin to entice fans for when Resurrection ultimately comes this summer. In addition to that, with Original Sin, I've seen some people point out some logic flaws we've had there with regards to Dexter previously saying he's never smoked before, and then he wound up doing so in Original Sin, or Dexter's first case with Batista maybe being different than what we've seen so far. Overall, since New Blood, there's just not been 100% consistency with small details here and there, so I think you're better off just realizing, yeah, there's going to be inconsistencies because that's just kind of the route they're taking at this point in time, so some of those small things are going to be incorrect, it seems like, unfortunately. In addition to that, we obviously have some speculation at this point in time as far as who the kidnap killer is. We'll get more details on that in the spoilers of this episode specifically. On top of that, I do want to point out there's not going to be an episode of Original Sin next week, so it's going to be a couple weeks between this episode and the next one. I think they're going to be filming maybe some Resurrection stuff, and that's why the delay here, but if you remember earlier on, we got episode 2 and 3 in the same week. That's because this next week is the gap week that they're taking to make up for that, so just be aware there's not going to be an episode next week and not going to be a review for the episode, so it's going to be 2 weeks until we get episode 7 ultimately. So jumping into some of the high-level overview thoughts, as far as characters go in this episode, I thought Dexter was mostly good as far as Patrick Gibson's role there. He was a little bit too over the top in some scenes. It feels like he's playing very dumb in a lot of scenes and being just very goofy here and there, and I understand maybe that was the assignment as far as the expectation of how Dexter acts, but some scenes it feels like a little bit too much, like he's playing too ignorant to normal social cues, and maybe, as once again, that's kind of the point of the character, but it feels a little bit unbelievable in some scenes just because he's gone through life, he's seen things interacting with him, and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense in some instances. Beyond that, Deb I felt like was fine here, Harry was fine, the captain overall I thought was fine here as well. I don't think he was as strong as he was in prior episodes, Patrick Dempsey's character. It just feels like he also was a little bit too over the top in some of the scenes he was in. Beyond that, we didn't get many other characters that are staples to Dexter in this episode. Honestly, Sofia, Deb's friend, probably had more screen time than Masuka, Batista, Tanya, LaGuerta. Like, a lot of them I feel like I kind of sidelined once again in this episode for mainly the 3 Morgans, as well as the captain was a little bit more highlighted here. But beyond that, we're really not focusing that much on some of these Miami Metro characters, it feels like, in this season. So a little bit bummed to see that take place here. As far as the plot goes, I feel like we started with a really intense scene that had my hopes pretty high for this episode. But after that, we really spent a lot of time on filler content. Things like Dexter's social life, things like drawn out stalking and researching of certain people, and once again, Harry flashback scenes, which honestly, I feel like they've milked those probably a little bit too long. We're definitely getting them for the entirety of the 10-episode season, but it feels like they probably didn't really need to do that. They're really stretching out some of these scenes where Harry's with Laura, and they're just talking about the same stuff we've gone over with their relationship being complicated and her wanting to back out of things, but he's like, no, keep going. They just keep doing a lot of those things over and over, and it doesn't seem like we're adding much to the plot by doing that. Just continuing the same storyline over and over again. Yeah, it just feels like overall with this episode, we didn't get much plot development across the board. We really just end the episode with something I expected going into the episode, with Dexter essentially having his sloppiness catch up with him, and we kind of leave off with the cliffhanger, so we're gonna have to wait a couple weeks to see what comes of that, but not really super enticed by how they ended things and the stuff that happened throughout the entirety of the episode. Honestly, it just feels like there's not much value here, which is kind of tough to have this far into the season. Episode 6 of 10, we should be really getting into some of those really intense scenes at this point in time, especially with having to wait a couple weeks for the next episode. Felt like they should have picked a good episode to have that gap week, because I don't know, I I guess we kind of had a bit of a cliffhanger, but if I wasn't interested in the show, would I come back after having to wait another week? I don't know. It feels like they probably should have done a little bit more in this episode if they wanted to really keep retention of newer fans. So overall as a rating, I kind of debated with this one because honestly, I didn't really enjoy this one that much, and especially compared to the last episode, feels like we took quite a dip from this. But if I'm being realistic, I'm probably going to give this one a neutral rating. It's just neutral in the areas of this far in the season, as I mentioned. I really expected the high highs to be happening in a lot of these tense scenes, but we're not really getting that with this episode, so we're going to say neutral, but I'm pretty low on it overall in my opinion. Okay, so now jumping into the details, so spoiler warning here, we're going to talk about the details of the episode. Starting things off, we have the kid of the captain who's playing his Sega in the car, and he has these headphones on, and his mom's out back in the garage trying to pack the car and things like that, and she gets attacked by somebody who's in this mask, and then sure enough, the guy goes and grabs the kid as well, and the mom's tied up, and we assume the person leaves with the kid and leaves the mom in the garage all by herself. We then cut to Deb and Dexter at home, and they're just talking with one another, and Deb's pointing out that they're going on a double date soon. She kind of mocks Dexter's clothes. She's like, you need to dress nice for Gio, trying to set a good impression to him. She winds up saying, oh, Sofia likes guys in plaid. She has some weird lumberjack fetish going on, which is definitely a shout out to season 8 when we have Dexter end with being a lumberjack, it felt like. We then have Harry come in and say, hey, Dexter, we gotta go to this crime scene. They go to this crime scene of this big arena, and there's somebody dead on the ground there. And Dexter does his recounting of the scene, similar to a prior episode where he's just reliving the experience and just going to his primal instincts as far as retelling the story, what took place here. And it seems like this person got 2 bags placed on their head. Essentially, they threw 1 bag on their head and the person's hands were tied, but there was a hole in the bag and they're like, hey, how did this happen? Sounds like the killer put a hole in the first bag because he wanted to kind of play with his food and then put a second bag on his head. So super messed up, but he wanted the victim to live longer and ultimately torture him for a longer period of time. Dexter makes the suggestion maybe this crime is related to the 2 other crimes that they've already gone through, and says, hey, maybe the criminal's getting more intimate. That's why the same weapon's not used. We had the gun, then we had the strangling, then we had the bag over the head. So it feels like maybe he's getting more intimate with how he's killing people. And LaGuerta's like, I don't know about that. And Harry's like, hey, stick to gathering evidence. Let the detectives build the case. We then cut to a flashback of Harry and Laura hooking up. We actually see them hooking up this time. And Laura's like, hey, when can I be done as your informant? And we kind of know where this is going, with Harry continuing to peer pressure her to work as the informant and eventually get too close to the sun. And Harry's like, hey, stay a bit longer. She eventually is like, hey, go home to your wife, clearly building a little bit of tension between the 2 of them. We then cut back to Miami Metro, where Dexter's in the office studying Levi Reed. He has a realization, oh, my 3rd kill. This is going to make me a serial killer, which kind of surprises me. He didn't consider that when he was trying to kill Mad Dog. I feel like he should have been thinking those things prior to this, since that would have been his 3rd kill. But either way, now he's thinking about this being his 3rd kill, making him an official serial killer. We have somebody call into the office, and Clark picks up the phone, and he goes in the captain's room, and ultimately we know what he's telling him, saying, hey, your kid's been kidnapped. And the captain's just throwing stuff. He's just like in a fit of rage. And the ex-wife comes in, and the guy she's with comes in, and they start arguing back and forth, saying, hey, this is your fault. You taunted this guy and things like that. So they're really at each other's throats. The captain then cuts to a more docile moment, asking his wife, hey, are there any clues you can give me as far as what the guy looked like or anything you really know? And she offers really nothing here, and he walks out, and Harry goes to support him. So throughout the episode, that happens a lot. Harry is really the supportive role here, where he sees the captain struggling, doing things that he may have done in the past, and offering kind of that shoulder to lean on for the captain. So great to see that from Harry here. Then we cut to Dexter stalking Levi Reed here. Feels like a lot of filler, where he's just doing his research and gathering information as far as where Levi goes, what he does, how he acts, things along those lines. And eventually, when he's gathering more evidence in Miami Metro, he runs into Camilla. She says something like, hey, if you want to borrow the boat, it's a great way to show a girl a good time. So once again, setting up the idea of Dexter eventually getting the slice of life in the future. Still in Miami Metro, we have Dexter and Harry talking to one another, and Dexter mentions to Harry, hey, this kid's probably only got 10 days, based off the timeline of the first kid that got kidnapped. Then we cut to Harry with a flashback once again. He's in a van listening to Laura, who's going in as the informant with these bad guys. They're going to a meeting point in the shipyard, and we kind of get a little bit of tease here with some of these shipping containers being shown. She's ultimately taken to a room where this guy's tied up, and the criminal's saying, this guy lied to us, and he winds up cutting the guy's finger off, and Laura is super shocked, and Harry's about to go running in to save her, but they wind up holding off, and it sounds like Laura's been promoted, actually, to take the role of the guy who just got his finger cut off. We then cut to present time with the double date of Dexter and Deb with Gio and Sofia, and it's super awkward throughout the beginning of this. He winds up meeting Gio and says something like, hey, nice teeth, man, and just winds up sitting next to Deb. Deb's like, go sit next to Sofia, you weirdo. So he goes over there, winds up ordering a ton of food, and Sofia's like, hey, I don't like hot wings, and he's like, that's all for me. Once again, leaning really into the Dexter eats a ton of food joke, which feels a little bit over the top at this point. We've done it quite a few times in some of these episodes. As I mentioned previously, I don't remember Dexter eating an insane amount of food in the original series. I know he ate periodically, but it wasn't like crazy amounts. They're really hammering that home in this specific series for some reason. He then awkwardly starts to talk about the murder case from earlier, and Deb and Sofia are kind of like, okay, kind of weird, dude. They wind up going to play darts, and they're throwing the darts, and Deb's doing pretty good, and Sofia's doing a horrible job. She's like throwing it against the wall, and Dexter thinks back to when he was stalking Levi, and he's like, all right, I'm going to do what he did. And he grabs her arm and helps her throw it, and of course she throws a great throw, and he winds up making a good impression on her. You have another guy in the bar run into Deb, and Gio really aggressively comes to her defense and really threatens the guy. I don't know if this is kind of supposed to be a red herring, because there's a lot of people already suspecting Gio as far as the potential kidnapper, and he's being very aggressive in this scene, but if I'm being honest, I'll get more details later, but Deb already dates the ice truck killer. Are we going to do that again, where she's dating the main killer of the season? That's something, an argument against Gio that I would say makes it less likely it's him. But either way, we'll get to that point when we discuss it. Dexter winds up putting his arm around Sofia. She like grabs his arm, puts it on her chest. Dexter winds up going to the bathroom, and she follows him in there and winds up giving him a good time. When they come out of the bathroom, Deb's like, hey, let's go prank Tiffany. And I'm thinking, oh, they're going to go egg her house or toilet paper her house or something. But no, they're like, hey, we're going to hotwire and steal her car. So they're in there doing that, and Gio's trying to hotwire it, and Dexter's like, you want me to try? And I don't think Gio would typically say, oh yeah, go for it. But he winds up doing that, and sure enough, Dexter figures it out right away. So they wind up leaving in their car, and Gio and Deb wind up leaving in Tiffany's car. When Dexter drops Sofia off, she's like, hey, do you want to hang out tomorrow night? He says something like, oh, I got bowling. So once again, a call to the original series where he's a bowler, obviously. And then we have Deb and Gio, who just leave Tiffany's car on the beach, and some cops show up and they just run away. We then cut to Miami Metro, where LaGuerta goes up to Harry and mentions to Harry, hey, the victim does seem to have some similarities with the other two, mentioning that Dexter may be right about the three all being aligned to one killer. We then transition to a flashback with Harry and Laura, and they have the cut off finger of that guy, and Laura like, clearly wants out, and Harry keeps pushing, no, stay here, and she's like, would you put your wife through this? And he's like, oh, I don't know if I would. And then his partner shows up and realizes, oh, your kid's being delivered, so he rushes over to the hospital. He goes into the room with Doris and the baby. That definitely does not look like a newborn baby, but I realize for TV, that's kind of how you have to do things. It also doesn't really look like a hospital, but that's once again nitpicking quite a bit. And we have Doris say, hey, I know you're with somebody. You have a kid now. You have to stop. So apparently she realizes that Harry's been sleeping around with somebody, and she says, stop this. And he's like, okay, I promise it's over with her. We then cut back to present time, where Dexter's stalking Levi Reed, ultimately trying to kill him. And he runs into Clark conveniently that night. And unlike future Dexter, where in the original series, if he had something go wrong where he was stalking somebody, he would immediately abort the mission. Like he does that with Miguel at one point, where they're like stalking somebody, and Miguel recognizes one of his friends, and Dexter's like, no, we're out. This guy recognizes you, can't do this tonight, not doing this tonight. But it feels like in this instance, maybe because he's still learning, he continues to chase Levi Reed despite running into Clark and knowing it's him. Personally, I'm wondering if Clark may be involved in some way with the strangling case, but we'll have to find out there in the future. We then have Dexter find Levi Reed in the alleyway, and he stabs him through his shirt with the M99 and takes him to a for sale empty house. And here we have Dexter doing the one-liners. It feels like he's done quite a few of these in this season, where he's going to this final kill, and he gives some really cheesy line where he says, killing and romance. Turns out the two have some things in common. It's about the anticipation, the build-up, and the happy ending. So try to be a little bit funny there with the one-liners. So we have Dexter and Levi on his kill table. Surprised here, Dexter tells Levi who he is, despite the Mad Dog situation going wrong, where Mad Dog runs away. He tells him straight up, hey, I'm Harry's kid. I'm here to kill you, things like that. We then have Dexter show Levi the Polaroids of the people he killed. He also mentions, hey, you're going to be my third kill. This is going to make me a serial killer. He asks Levi, why'd you rob the home when you knew the kids were going to be there? And Levi mentions, I want to see the fear in their eyes. So definitely a bad guy overall. And he mentions, you're just like me, Dexter. Dexter then points out there's one big difference. I don't kill innocent people. Harry gave me a code. And he stabs Levi there, and it's a pretty vicious stab. We see like blood fly everywhere after doing so. We then cut to Miami Metro, where they're working on the case for the captain's kidnapped kid, and it feels like they're working 24/7 around the clock, because they realize there's a limited amount of time before this kid ultimately may be killed. We have Tanya tell the captain, Aaron, there's nothing to go on. We swept through the garage. There's nothing left behind. Batista's going through the timeline of events that they've had with the prior judge kidnapping, and the captain's like, you guys are wasting my time. They assume at this point it's been a cartel member, since the judge's kid was kidnapped and the captain's kid was kidnapped at this point. And the captain's just losing his cool. He's just throwing stuff everywhere. And it feels like in this scene specifically, perhaps a little bit too over the top acting for Patrick Dempsey here. We then have Harry go to console the captain. Captain's like, hey, you're not going to offer me any coffee. And Harry's like, how about something stronger? So they have a drink with one another. And Harry's just trying to relate with him, realizing that his son wound up passing away as well. So he knows the feeling of having your son in some kind of dire situation, mentioning, hey, you can't protect them from everything, but these guys are the best at what they do because of you. So trying to really amp up the captain, make him feel better. Simultaneously here, we have Dexter wrapping up with Levi Reed. And we also have the kid who was kidnapped. So the captain's kid, we see a glimpse of him in one of those cells. Same situation from earlier in the series where you have the kidnapped kid. So we realize it seemed pretty obvious, but it's the same kidnapper at this point. And he puts some food through the little chute. And the kid's freaking out because he sees some blood in there. So just highlighting, yes, this kid was kidnapped by the same person. And then the episode just ends with Dexter going to Alligator Alley and realizing there's cops there and there's an active crime scene where they have found Ferrera's arm, which can probably be identified. And we have Dexter end the episode with saying, what could be worse? So trying to leave us with a bit of a cliffhanger, but probably not going to be any major deal for Dexter. Overall, it felt like we did a lot of swirling, a lot of Dexter's social life in this episode, and a lot of drawn out things that didn't feel like we really progressed the storyline. We did, once again, Dexter going on a date. We had Harry flashbacks of stuff we pretty much knew already. We had, I don't know, Dexter doing some stalking, but it wasn't as interesting this time. It feels like he was just going through the same research steps, not uncovering really anything new. He didn't really find out, oh, this guy did something bad that we weren't aware of. It was just, hey, let's watch him in action and try to replicate him when we're on our date as well. So just felt like they didn't really add much here. It was a lot of filler and fluff, it felt like, especially being 6 episodes into the season. And yeah, just not a whole lot of value add for me personally. As far as the kidnapped killer goes, there's obviously a few candidates at this point in time. Kind of rattle through the list. So we have the captain. And this is one that I didn't really think because I felt like he was being really over the top in prior episodes. But when this episode started, honestly, I kind of leaned towards him at some points because his kid was getting kidnapped, his wife got knocked out, and somebody that would have access to the house would obviously be him. So in that instance, I was like, this feels like this could be him, especially when you have him then shown in his office, and it's like, that could have been some time later. So it's possible it's him, but honestly, if you have Patrick Dempsey be the bad guy again after doing, like, spoilers, I guess, for other stuff he's in, but after doing things like Thanksgiving or, I don't know, it just feels like not a whole lot there. And capturing your own kid and having that big display, it feels kind of like witty to do, but once again, since it's something he's done before, I don't feel like it's as unique for this season specifically. Next up, we have Gio, which I previously would have backed off from because obviously Deb has dated the Ice Truck Killer. We're not going to probably do that in Original Sin and Season 1 of Dexter, where Deb's dating the guy who's the big bad. That feels a little bit too much, right? Because too convenient to have that happen once again. And it doesn't really have the shock value if you're doing it once again. So that's one I don't know, I've been a little bit mixed on because we obviously had the scene in the bar where he was very assertive and aggressive. Maybe that was a red herring. The big one that I would have thought previously that people have been talking about is Tanya. She's kind of flying under the radar. The prior episode, we have her sneaking away to do some stuff. So feels like she's kind of a under the radar example of somebody that could, hey, I could do these things. And she's obviously the one sweeping the crime scenes as well. So she can take care of those things. But I don't know. We saw the person. They clearly looked like a man. So unless she's working with somebody, that one's a little bit hard to believe based off of the just structure of the person doing the kidnapping, because we got to see them capture the captain's kid and beat up the wife of the captain. So that one feels a little bit harder to believe at this point in time. Beyond that, there's just kind of outlier things that I thought of, like, oh, it could be the ex-wife's new husband because he's just making a big deal of this thing and he really wants, I don't know, to get money or something. Could be something outlier-y like that as well. There's obviously the main lead that the detectives are going off of, which is, it's the cartel. Maybe you could do that if you have somebody that's really high up in the cartel, like if you had something like Estrada's the one doing this, that could be a kind of a cool tie-in. I hadn't really thought about that prior to this episode, but that could be a really interesting way to tie in the flashbacks of Harry with the current storyline, whether it's Estrada or somebody else who's in some of those flashbacks. Maybe the guy who cut the person's finger off, something along those lines. Could be an interesting way to now include the flashbacks as far as meeting up and making sense as far as why you're telling all these stories that now align to the present time and the ultimately killer and kidnapper. So honestly, I kind of talked myself into thinking that maybe the leading candidate at this point. I went into this episode thinking Tanya, but after seeing some of the stuff, I think it could be somebody in the cartel that's from the flashbacks with Harry. That's, if I'm making a guess right now, kind of out of the blue, just kind of changing my opinion, that's where I'm thinking, because the other ones I pointed out, you have the captain, feels a little bit much, although it'd be kind of interesting having his family get involved with it, and he's the one that did it. So that's really the only interesting line I have there. The Geo one would make sense, but once again, you had the ice truck killer. Maybe Geo's involved with the cartel and somebody else that he works with who did it. That could be possible. Tanya, I thought previously, but as I said, the body shape doesn't make sense. And then as far as the outliers go, I think the cartel, as far as someone in the flashbacks, that's my current leading candidate. But what are you guys' thoughts? Who do you think the kidnapper is? What are your thoughts on this episode overall? Did you like it? Did you have some of the gripes that I had and felt like they didn't add a whole lot with this episode? So just give me all your thoughts as far as speculation on this episode and the future of the season as well. So thank you guys so much for watching, and hope to talk to you again soon.